for 10 years. So Ellie is going to be doing the next panel, which is all about sort of, where's deal-making trends going. So Ellie, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Editor-in-Chief for the Commercial Insights portfolio of publications, news analysis publications at Informa, Pharma Intelligence. So as Mike says, that includes Scrip, In Vivo and Generics Bulletin. So my editorial team overseeing here in Europe and also in the States spends a huge chunk of their time overseeing, writing about, deals, deal-making, financing. And so, we can certainly see that in the past year, we've had a lot of pressure in our team to cover everything. So, it's very clear that there's a lot of money coming into the sector. So that's one of the themes that I hope we can cover in our panel today. One of the aspects of deal making that I hadn't actually thought about before we called this panel was it came to mind when Mike had Elizabeth Holmes up there and Matt Hancock thinking about, maybe on your list of losers next year, will there be some of this government contracting that was made in haste and maybe repented at leisure? Don't know, diagnostics, maybe we need to look a bit more at that. And I don't know if we're going to discuss that today. I've got a great panel here from a variety of companies, big pharma, biotech, investing, and we're going to talk about the cash flowing into biotech, talk a bit about what biotech needs from big pharma and how that's changing, also what big pharma needs from biotech and how that's changing, and then thinking about what factors could affect the trends in financing and deal making in the coming year. Obviously, we will touch on the impact of COVID on the sector and the deal making environment. And maybe touch on how big pharma is changing its organizational makeup and how that has an impact on the relationships it has with the rest of the sector. So, please let me introduce our panelists today. We have Will Walker-Arnott from Charles Stanley. Would you like to come up? Luke Henry from Quell Therapeutics, Dan Marshall from MSD, and David Mead from Isogenica. So I'd like to just start off by asking each panellist to introduce themselves and maybe explain a bit about your perspective and your experience when it comes to deal making. So if we start down the end there with Will.
Yeah, hi. Morning, everyone. Will Walker-Arnott from Charles Stanley. So I work at Charles Stanley, which is one of the largest wealth managers in the UK, currently managing about 40 billion of assets. We primarily actually work for private clients, so wealthy individuals and also some charities as well. Where I step into the overall matrix of things is that we tend to invest in later stage companies, so companies which are listed on the public markets. So we're less involved in the more illiquid early stage companies, but we do get involved in later stage companies. I mean, an example of one of our best investments this year for clients has been actually Decra Pharmaceuticals, which is a pharmaceutical company which focuses on companion animals, so dogs and cats, which has recently got into the FTSE 100, which we're very excited about, but has been one of our best performing stocks. But that's me.
Thank you. And then Luke from Quell.
Yeah, good morning. Luke Henry, Chief Business Officer at Quell Therapeutics. So we're a Treg, engineered Treg cell therapy company based here in London, building off some of the science that's come out of the founders' labs at King's College, UCL, and also in Germany at Hanover Medical School. So really what the ambition of the business is to try and use the sort of T-cell therapy modality that's really been pioneered in the oncology sector, obviously with the development of CAR-Ts and then all of the follow-on assets, but really trying to use that in Tregs, the suppressive cells of the immune system, to try and bring the modality really outside of oncology into all of the other disease states where the immune system is dysregulated. So our first program is actually in solid organ transplantation. We're about to initiate a phase 1/2 study in liver transplantation, where we're trying to use the cells to alleviate the patients from the immunosuppressant regimen that they live on. And we have follow-on assets already coming through in both the autoimmune space and in the neuroinflammation space. Exciting to see how this plays through. The field's getting quite exciting and hot. It's nice that a UK company is sort of pioneering it from London alongside many other companies in the west and east coast of the States.
Thanks, Luke. And then we have Dan Marshall, who's replaced Katare Ahmadi from MSD. Couldn't be here today.
Yeah, I'm not Katare. Daniel Marshall, Director of Business Development at MSD. So I cover oncology for Europe and the Middle East. I think obviously at MSD we're keen to be, as a science-led organisation, we like to be out and about with biotech, looking for innovative new approaches. It's fantastic to be on this panel here today. Thank you.
Thank you. And then David from Isogenica.
Morning, thank you. Morning, everybody. Isn't it great to be out again? It's just so exciting, really. Even to see Mike, it's great. So Dave Mead, I'm head of commercial currently at Isogenica, a Cambridge-based biotech company. Our niche is single-domain antibodies, in particular the VHH format. We have a couple of assets that have been partnered in the US in phase 2 and phase 1. So we do discovery and early antibody development, and we've also embarked on our own programs, which is really formatting antibodies to meet various biological conditions. So, morning, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, so if we could just get started with thinking about how, as Mike highlighted, how much cash has been flowing into the sector, both venture capital and public money. What does that mean for the way pharma and biotech are signing deals? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I think personally, from my point of view, I think if you're a small biotech, you're kind of given there's so much cash around at the moment. Making that decision about equity dilution versus asset dilution, I think the balance is swinging the other way now, and I think as a consequence of that, we're probably seeing larger pharma deals that are earlier, certainly from my perspective anyway. And I think if you look at deals as a whole, people say, well, there's loads of cash coming into the sector, deal values are up, etc. But if you actually look at new company creations, it's still very flat. And I think what we're seeing really is large deals, but later deals, because there's a lot of cash there. But then in terms of new innovative approaches coming through with startups, it's very flat. And I actually think because the problem there isn't the cash, it's the access to talent, I think, there, which is driving that. And I think that's probably why, if you look, say, US versus UK, in the US, I think they have a bit better access to talent. There's more people there to help spur those early innovative approaches. And that's probably why I think they're a little bit better at doing that early stage company creation. There's certainly VCs, that back companies such as yourself that I think do that very well over here, but it's not as common, I would say.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, can I just comment on the US versus UK, particularly in the listed environment? Because, you look at the UK market at the moment and you kind of can equate it to Jurassic Park. It's pretty antiquated. The companies listed in the UK are predominantly financial or oil and gas. They're 19th, if you're being generous, 20th century companies. This month, Apple reached a valuation which is bigger than the entire FTSE 100. Which just sort of encapsulates how anemic growth has been in the UK. Just some other stats. Since Brexit, the FTSE 100 is up 39%. The S&P 500 in the US is up 140%. 5% of listings, global listings, have taken place in the UK. So we've obviously got a problem attracting technology and those kind of growth companies over here. Changes on the way, though, I would argue. So Lord Hill introduced this listing review whereby they are making changes. In particular, you can have a dual-listed company in the UK, which means owners and entrepreneurs can retain a controlling stake in a company. And we talked about Oxford Nanopore earlier, and they actually took advantage of this dual listing scenario, which probably drew them back to London. And that was a really successful IPO, which we got involved in. There was a 40% pop on day one, which was great. So we're hoping to see actually that the UK might be fighting back. So these listing reviews that Lord Hill has introduced may start to see a change. Mm-hmm. There has been some difficulties. You would have seen Deliveroo wasn't the most successful tech listing we've seen in March. Obviously, that's more tech-focused. And Darktrace, another company, has been a bit volatile since listing here, but it's good to see these companies are now considering listing in the UK, which they probably hadn't done previously.
And so, I mean, maybe we'll come back to the kind of the finance listing environment, but just thinking about the deals that are going on between strategic partners. So there's a lot more money, biotech companies are well funded. How has that impacted the kinds of deals that have been done and that you expect to see being done in the next year or two? You know, bearing in mind also that list values are going down, so you know maybe the tide will turn.
And maybe I'll comment from the biotech side. So I think the comment made earlier around sort of the trade-off between equity dilution and product dilution is kind of pertinent. And you know, depending on the stage we're at the moment, I think Mike gave a very nice overview that in the private market and certainly in the IPO markets, it stayed pretty robust through even 2021, and obviously after a great year in 20. Whereas the follow-ons and actually the valuations of the companies that have listed post-market hasn't been as great. And so when we think about access to capital, I mean, Quell's now a 2.5-year-old company. We've raised 220 million of private capital. You know, of course, it wasn't easy, but there's capital out there in the VCs and in the crossover funds that is there to be deployed. There's a pretty large amount of dry powder that's gone into those funds over the last 2 or 3 years that has to work through the system. And I think we've seen that playing through into the IPO market with the crossover funds playing that sort of coming in and then rising on the tide of the IPO. So that means as a young company, financing the business is not easy, but it's certainly easier than other periods of time. And that means actually the trade-off between raising further private rounds and then obviously thinking about the types of strategic deals that we do, it sort of starts to rebalance a bit. And whilst you know, bringing in non-dilutive capital in those deals is an important component, we're actually thinking a lot more about how that deal is going to help to accelerate, de-risk, bring in capabilities to enable us to scale out our pipelines to truly actually make you know, the company grow in a way that we think is value creating. And of course, that will come with some non-dilutive capital and financing that partners with it, but it's certainly not the sort of top factor that we're thinking about when we're coming into the deal-making phase. If I reflect then on the companies that are in the market, maybe having gone through IPO, looking at follow-on offerings, I think you know some of those valuations are starting to get quite suppressed. And I think if you look at the pharma industry, they're sitting on a ton of cash now, particularly these players who've come through, obviously making COVID vaccines. I think there was a report earlier this week that said there's 500 billion of cash sitting on the top 18 pharma companies, and they could obviously leverage that further. So I think my expectation is that we'll probably see some of that deployed into maybe later stage companies sitting in the NASDAQ with suppressed valuations, struggling to find ways to raise capital in the follow-on markets, and that could be actually a playthrough. Of course, for young companies like us, you know, for those partnering deals we're looking at, it's much more about the strategic synergy and intent of the two businesses together, alongside obviously bringing in some capital to support the growth.
I mean, it seems like a company like yours has so much more leverage now than it would have had 5-10 years ago when you'd have been struggling to raise a few million here and there that will keep you going, doing a little bit till the next thing. And any deal you could do with a pharma company, you certainly wouldn't have the kind of leverage that I assume you have now, having been able to raise 220 million.
Yeah, you're right. There's more degrees of freedom. So we're sort of, we have more optionality in terms of timing, in terms of the types of deals that we do. They're still really important. I don't want to like lose that point. I think as a young business and a biotech platform you're growing, I think we do still rely on the strategic partnerships with pharma to really make sure we can accelerate the exciting technology into the market in a way that we can really explore the opportunity. So there's still a really pivotal part of the value creation path for businesses. But I think the question is now timing, the type of the deal, where it fits in with the story, as opposed to being sort of pushed to doing it as a capital raising tool.
Can we dig more a bit into that type of deal question? David, do you have any thoughts on access to cash not necessarily being the most difficult thing at the moment? What challenges are you facing?
I think it's definitely true. There's a lot of cash in the world looking for a home, and our sector's, I think, taking advantage of that. I think CV19 has probably got more interest in our sector, a bit more belief and profile in it. It doesn't mean it's easy to get to. I think I've observed that there are some chunks of cash, and they tend to go to certain players. So if there's X million, it doesn't get spread evenly across the board, and that might be right because of the technologies or opportunity for those markets that they're facing. But I think you do see some large amounts here, and then it's sort of the crumbs off the table elsewhere. And as an SME, that does make life quite difficult. It, of course, then shapes, as you've mentioned here, the type of deal you can do with a big pharma. And doing deals with big pharma makes sense. Biotech and pharma are clearly different beasts. And pharma has lots of great attributes. It's a so-called machine to take things from beginning to end. Arguably, small biotechs are better at the beginning because they're a bit more nimble and a bit, quicker thinking. But hopefully that cash can then help the relationship, so it's more of a match of a synergy rather than beholden to them for the next sort of week's payroll, so to speak, and that you can actually establish your company to a good degree and then still have that valid and essential conversation with Pharma, but maybe not as equals, but actually as people who bring pieces of the jigsaw together.
Yeah. Dan, do you have anything to say about that kind of the relationship once you have a partner?
Yeah.
How is that evolving and how do you see it continuing to evolve?
I think there's a great realisation from Pharma that, I think we're kind of living through a bit of a renaissance with regards to modalities and different therapeutic approaches, and I think there's a realisation from Pharma, generally speaking, and certainly within MSD, that, tapping into biotech and, these novel innovative approaches is the way forward. I mean, 65-70% of our human medicine revenue comes from externally partnered assets, right? So it's clearly both financially and strategically important. With regards to deal making at MSD, I think 2021 was quite flat, if not slightly down. I think there's going to be a huge amount of probably pent-up demand industry-wide in 2022. People out there looking to deploy capital, and I think that will probably be driven by new innovative approaches, new modalities, tapping into new markets, like we've already mentioned cell therapy, solving some of the problems that are associated with those first-generation cell and gene therapies, for example, getting to those new next stage innovative type companies. Actually, to be fair, if you actually look at the amount of money we did deploy last year, is actually up, but that was obviously driven by one large deal, which is well publicised. So, but maybe we'll get onto that later. But yeah, I think it's a fantastic time to be a biotech. I think they have a lot more bargaining power than perhaps they used to. There's a lot of capital available, and I think now they're able to take assets later than perhaps they would have without Pharma, be that through the public means or through taking on private cash. Yeah. And and I think obviously we're seeing deals between Pharma and biotech which take that into account. I think the deal we just did Excellon, for example, right? But then also if you look at the early stage research deals, I think my old company Epidarex just did a really interesting one with Novartis on Dunad, for example, right? So yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more flexibility in that kind of deal structure, and I think it's a fantastic time to be an early stage biotech, and I think it's fantastic for Pharma as well to be able to tap into that innovation.
Can we talk a bit more about what that flexibility, be more specific about what the flexibility in the deal making might look like? Where are the changes here? From anyone who's on either side of this.
Yeah, maybe I can comment. I think, rather than sort of vanilla out-licensing type deals, I think, particularly in some of these advanced modalities, we're looking much more at sort of co-development, because I think the pharma industry realised that they're not going to be the experts in the new modality per se, but they can bring a lot of capabilities to the table in terms of the translational understanding of disease states where the platform could be deployed, complementary assets, other aspects, obviously capital. And so I think actually that sort of early phase of the relationship becomes actually very collaborative, because we're trying to plug essentially two scientific platforms together to really exploit the way to accelerate that science towards a clinic, through the clinic to obviously clinical data, and in a way that actually makes sense where the best partner within their relationship who has the relevant capabilities to push does it. So I think as a cell therapy developer, of course, manufacturing for us is a really critical part of our platform, and I'm not sure that many of the strategic parties we talk to want to necessarily plug us directly in and take over manufacturing, for example, because they're really looking at us as not only an asset company, but also a manufacturing platform that enables them to explore the utility of these types of modalities in the clinic. And so the sort of nature of the relationship kind of will evolve over time. It's much more collaborative early, maybe downstream it becomes a little bit more driven by the pharma company, obviously with their leverage in late stage development and commercial. But I think also the ability to come up with more creative deal structures where the biotech who have aspirations to build businesses, not just to build products, can strike deals with pharma in a way that it's actually a win-win for both companies trying to actually build out the capabilities they're looking to do over time.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that kind of access to manufacturing, and to think that big pharma are looking to new biotech companies to access manufacturing capabilities is unusual. So this whole kind of flourishing of advanced therapy modalities is, I think, must be changing the whole landscape a lot.
If you look at cell therapy, I mean, even some of the gene therapy acquisitions that have been done, I mean, a large part of the value driver has been access to the manufacturing footprint, which is interesting. And obviously with the mRNA story that's played through. I mean, the same is true there, right? And so I think it's interesting. It's kind of turned its head against sort of the more conventional modalities.
Yeah. David, do you have any more thoughts on that kind of what we need to build up? Because obviously there's perhaps a lack of manufacturing capabilities, and you mentioned lack of access to talent being a challenge, maybe lab space.
I think so. So I think where if you biotech and pharma can come together, and the cash is actually trying to help drive that. There is a skill shortage. I don't know if you did a show of hands in here today, how many people are struggling to get and retain good experienced scientists. I think there's a shortage of bench space. I think you're seeing that in terms of, if you take the Cambridge region and the builds going on around there, they could build and build again, and you see that in other parts of the world. So I think that is a bottleneck, and hopefully some of that cash can be directed towards that to get some of these products through. Why do we all do this? Well, we all do it obviously to have some probably quite average coffee this morning and earn a crust. But we do it for patients, don't we? Isn't that at the end of the day why we all do it? Isn't that the important thing? And I think me and Mike touched upon that in his presentation this morning. That's why we all get out of bed in the morning ultimately. There's that, and the cash is the lubricant which helps the smaller companies work with the big companies to achieve that end. And I think CV19 has been remarkable for the acceleration that we've seen this year. I mean, I've never seen it. I've been around the industry for 100 years. I've never seen anything move that quickly before. And I think if we could maintain that pace and that collaboration together, that would be tremendous, because just think of all the other diseases and areas that we can tap into and do that. We've shown we can do it.
Yeah.
If there's the will to do it. And we had to do it because we were all put on the edge of a cliff, weren't we? And locked in our bedrooms on bloody Zoom. So, that's a great focus. Yeah. But there are lots of other areas that clearly we need to be addressing. This is just an ongoing pandemic.
Just.
Exactly.
So maybe come to you, Will, because you're a generalist, and pharma and biotech have been thrown into the spotlight because of the pandemic. What have you seen around the kind of healthcare in the bigger picture, in the bigger investment picture? How does pharma look?
I was just going to make some points actually, because we talk about lab space and those types of topics. Investing in lab space is probably the hottest area in commercial property at the moment. And that's mainly because as a generalist investor, you're looking at the commercial property scene at the moment, you're thinking, do I really want to invest in retail at the moment? Do I want to invest in commercial property space? Probably not. And healthcare has that, to a generalist, it has that consistency and sort of defensive qualities that people like. So you're seeing a huge amount of investment and investment capital, particularly in a low interest rate world, going into commercial lab space. And just looking at a couple of deals, I mean, the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund purchased a 40% stake in a science park in Magdalen College recently. We've seen Blackstone, which is a big PE company in the US, invest $1 billion into that kind of area this year. And in my world, we've actually seen a life science REIT launched, which raised 300 million about a couple of months ago, and you're going to get like a sort of 4% yield there for investing in that space, which is very attractive to us when you've got interest rates at 0.1% at the moment.
That's really interesting. So
that is a really hot area, which I think is going to continue in 2022, which is, I think you could see a further wall of money going into that space.
And how does the UK measure up in that lab space investment versus other places, the US or Germany or Singapore or anywhere?
So the US is, as always, ahead of the game. So they sort of pioneered this space, and in particular having REITs, real estate investment trusts, which are focused on life science laboratories. But the UK has obviously got sniff of this and is really beginning to roll out products and securities in this area. So I'm hoping for you guys who are struggling with lab space and the like, there's going to be lots more capital coming that way.
Mm-hmm, that's interesting. And what about pharma and biotech in the bigger picture? What's the preference at the minute for this sector versus others?
So as a later stage investor, we tend to invest, when we're investing in earlier stage biotech, we tend to use, I think Mike was talking about ETFs earlier, but we tend to use a product which gives us a wide spread of early stage investors and early stage companies. And that, as Mike pointed out, it's been a bit of a struggle this year for the early stage biotech companies. If you weren't holding Moderna, you'd have been in a lot of pain, really, basically, everything, which is it just wiped the floor. But it tends to be cyclical. You go through stages. I mean, prior to that, the biotech sector had been absolutely flying, so we're not going to stop investing in that area. We understand that inherently more risky, and you're going to have bad years and followed by much more productive years. So we're still very keen to invest in that space.
Yeah, and how about the UK environment for listing, things like the LSE versus NASDAQ? We saw the Oxford Nanopore listing. What do you think is going to happen over the next year or so?
I think, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, I think the UK is beginning to fight back with these Lord Hill reviews. So hopefully you're going to see more companies attracted to listing in the UK. So hopefully that will be a good development. Another thing which I think is worth pointing out, it may sound quite a boring area to focus on, but it's pension reform. So Rishi Sunak is at the moment consulting on allowing pension funds. In the UK, we have about 500 billion of assets in defined benefit pensions, and they're restricted investing in private equity and venture capitalist funds because there's a limit on the fees they can charge. But Rishi Sunak is currently consulting on that. We'll find out in February 2022. But if he does pass that through, suddenly early-stage pharma companies, early-stage life science companies are going to have access to a lot more capital through people's pensions. And I think that's something to really look at. So that could actually really open the taps for people. So keep an eye on that. I'm sure Rishi is being lent on by a lot of his friends he used to work with at Goldman Sachs and the like, who are pushing him to do this. But it could really open up some capital for early-stage investors.
That's good to know. Maybe we just go back a bit to that kind of the deals between pharma and biotech. Do you have any more kind of thoughts on how things will change over the next year or so, David?
I think, as I touched upon before, I think looking forward, with this more accessible amount of cash around, that we will get a better balance of deal between SME and big pharma. And it's not just about the financial returns. I think it's actually seeing your assets progress, the diligence on the assets. We've all observed technologies or companies sometimes picked up by big pharma with respect and then put on the shelf as a bit of a nice-to-have toy and then never looked at again. It happens, and maybe it was a good decision at the time, and then it makes no sense. But I think the ability to see your technology progress, again, heading towards patients, but to negotiate those aspects in the deal. So it's not just saying, I need a few more million to keep the bank running, which of course you do, but it's actually finding the synergy and the relationship, the terms in the deal that allow these things to go forward, and if not, then to find an alternative route and how you do it. So I think cash is certainly going to be a key to that. An interesting question for Will. Do you see, in terms of manufacturing, so GMP manufacturing, do you ever see any private investment, or is it all coming from the sector itself? So it comes from pharma or biotechs who build these facilities. Do you ever see any third party, so to speak, investment, or is it on labs?
I haven't seen that, no.
No.
I haven't seen that, no. So.
That's interesting. And maybe Luke, if you could speak to that kind of balance between the way that you're trying to work your platform through a deal with a big pharma or a larger partner versus what you're trying to keep and develop forward on your own. How do you think that's evolving?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think it's hard to build a young biotech without pharma. I think it is really important to have those types of enabling partnerships that bring in, quite frankly, skill sets and capabilities and capital that you can't just, one of my investors in my last company said, you can never build biotechs on equity alone. And I think there is truth to that. I think it's really hard to just go all the way. And I think the nice thing about the current environment is you can have the aspiration with a platform, and you can develop areas off that platform where you believe as a business you can actually build all the way through. You can retain ownership of those verticals. In our case, we're looking at transplantation really as sort of something that we actually think we could execute on as a small business through even development, even into the commercial space, given the sort of nature of that specialty market. But there are other areas where, quite frankly, it would be very hard for us to go all the way. And we've got a program in type 1 diabetes, which could be incredibly interesting in the context of intervening very early when patients are just diagnosed with recent onset type 1 diabetes and trying to reset the autoimmune response to those patients so that they don't have to go onto insulin. That's a really aspirational program. But as a young company thinking about how we could take that program through to the market, is challenging. And of course, that's where this nice synergy between young biotechs with interesting platforms and the pharma industry really emerges. And of course, that's just one example of where we could go with that. But we're really reliant on finding strategic partnerships with pharma companies who know how to navigate the complexities of the development path and the commercialization of those types of approaches. And so it's sort of it's a really key part of being able to exploit the utility of the scientific advancements that you can develop in the young biotech company. So, for us as a 2.5-year-old company, we've got clear places in our pipeline that we think we want to retain as part of our core sort of value story that we'll build over time and we'll finance the business off. And we've got clear areas where we know, like type 1 diabetes, like some of the neuroinflammation work we're doing, where that could be really accelerated by these types of partnerships. So we're now, I think, going into 2022, it's kind of an exciting time for us as we're able to navigate sort of how we then continue to fund both our own pipeline, but also explore the utility of it beyond that with the relevant partners that we end up joining with.
So Dan, looking at it from the other side, when biotechs come to you and they have a vision of some sort, like Luke's maybe outlined just now, what do you feel like? What feels good when a biotech company comes and wants to offer something or discuss something? How much negotiation do you have to make to kind of to get to a place which feels realistic?
Yeah, sure. I think the days of pharma just signing a check are long gone, right? I think certainly when we're looking for new partnerships, we're working with innovative, companies that are bringing a lot to the table. There needs to be that first and foremost scientific synergy there. Our scientists are involved, from day one. All the BD team, have a scientific background, of course. And I think first and foremost, what gets us excited is novel, innovative science and a rationale as to how we can, treat particular patient groups, with unmet needs. And then, everything else kind of falls into place around that. I think, it can be very flexible in terms of kind of how to structure a deal, and pulling in expertise from the company and leveraging expertise within the biotech, to get the best outcome for everyone, really. I think gone are the days of the founders coming, hoping they're just going to become millionaires day one overnight. Obviously, these things tend to be kind of relationships that have gone on for years until you get that kind of full transfer over into the pharma company and full development. And I think it's highly valuable for everyone involved. Obviously, we can bring certain things, like as you've alluded to, the clinical development expertise, being able to scale into larger markets and running some of the clinical trials which are out of reach to small, privately financed biotechs that are very large. So I think it's especially, and I think COVID has probably helped with this actually. This kind of these flexible models and access. I think it's a lot easier now to access expertise because we're less focused on geography. Everyone's online, everyone's speaking, and I think that's really helped with for example, putting biotechs in contact with a bench scientist that has a particular expertise in a certain area. That's far easier than it used to be. And I think that's one of the pros that's come out of COVID.
So one of the kind of charges that was levelled at some biotech companies in the past has been that scientist founders are not realistic and they're going to pharma and we've got to get rid of this guy. How is that still a fair charge, or was it ever a fair charge?
Is that me? Or?
Yes, it's you're our big pharma target today.
I'll take that one.
You can be honest.
In my experience, it's a very mixed bag. There are some that are unrealistic, but I think as long as they get a team around them that supplements their knowledge, they'll clearly bring something to the table and helps them move things forward, then that's great. I mean, there are founders that I've worked with who are absolutely fantastic and know exactly what it takes and are very open to working with people and leveraging expertise within the pharma company. I'd say it's a hugely mixed bag, and it's you can't really. I think on the average things are far better than they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we've seen that play through. I mean, certainly the sort of concept of company creating investors in the early part of biotech, something that was pioneered obviously out of the States, but we're starting to do a much better job of it, I think, in the UK with some of the investors who are already seeing they're not just putting money in, but they're actually taking scientific founders and actually sort of walking them through the development of business plans and incubating those companies before they sort of put capital behind them. And I think that model probably reduces some of the variability that you see in terms of the quality of the strategic plans that come out of those types of science.
I think it's a fantastic point. Yeah, I think the advent of these kind of company building venture capital groups with their in-house entrepreneurs, And often a lot of these guys run, CEO courses and founder courses. And I think as a farmer, when you look at a company and you see those sorts of investors involved, you automatically think this is going to be of a particular standard.
Yeah.
Do you think also that we have seen some flow from pharma back into biotech?
Yeah.
Quite senior, well-known names going back. So do you think that also, the door revolving a bit more,
Absolutely,
helps?
absolutely. I think having people that are aware of how pharma think and work at a biotech is invaluable, I would say. But likewise, I think people often don't make a big enough thing of having a biotech mentality as well. And having both within the biotech is useful because there is undoubtedly a different way of thinking, a different appetite to risk. So I think obviously we're looking to these companies for innovative approaches. So we don't want them to just be clones of us, right? So leveraging the expertise and that kind of risk taking and innovative ways of thinking of the biotech founders and academic founders is obviously important as well. But grounded in pharma mentality is always useful.
Yeah. So David, maybe I'll come to you and we talk a bit about the impact of COVID and we think about the huge amount of speedy collaboration that was taking place. We had to solve it. What do you think can last from all of that and how can that affect deal making beyond COVID but in wider therapeutic areas in the next year or so?
I think what I'd like to see, which might be a little bit rose-tinted, but I'd like to think that we, as I touched on before, that we can maintain some of the sort of being more expedient, more agile as we work together to an endpoint. Again, it's about the patient, but it's also commercially about getting the science translated to a product and get that return on the investment. I'd like to think that we could learn from that and also with the regulatory authorities. I mean, clearly that's a very essential hurdle that we all have to get through. We realise that. But working together, and I think we saw that in some of the CV19 developments where there was a very tight-knit cooperation from the beginning almost to take these things through. I think that would also be helpful, and if we could see some of that adopted. We talked before about that we are more connected, although personally Zoom is great, but this for me is just, far better in 3D. But I think it does allow us to reach out and work more flexibly at a distance. And I was just wondering about cash and investment, if you look to the UK, as to whether we are a bit southeast-centric. It's sort of a semi-open question. But I have an opinion, having worked in various companies, not just outside the UK, but in the UK, where if you start to get away from that sort of Watford Gap, so to speak, border, that there seems to be a difficulty historically in getting attention. And, I've seen some good companies, whether it be medtech or biotech, that just don't seem to get the noise and the cash requirement, and it just seems to centre around that sort of Oxford, London. Now, whether that will change, or maybe that's, I'm open to being, wrong on that perception. But I'd like to see more of that, and perhaps this digitalisation will enable the awareness that there is something good in Aberdeen or Belfast or wherever it might be that's just a bit further than an hour train ride from London.
So to what extent are deal makers going out looking geographically in the furthest corners, do you think? Do you wait for the Aberdeen company to show itself, or do you actually go looking in Aberdeen?
I mean, I'd have to look to investors to that to answer that question from sort of this side of the fence. I think you have to be making some noise unless you're in a cluster, which is quite exciting, and therefore there's lots happening. So Cambridge is the classic one, of course, but and people will go to that. They'll go to events and they'll network, and it'll all become awareness. We both used Aberdeen as an example. Will people take that flight or train ride up there just to go and have a look? I think the Aberdonians need to make some noise at the moment, is my view, to get the investment, and that's not always easy.
No.
Maybe a similar theme, but sort of the US-UK thing's been quite interesting, I think, during COVID as well. I think, the so-called geographical disadvantage of not being in Kendall Square or in the Bay Area, I think to a certain degree has been broken down. We just closed a financing recently with a mixture of European and US investors, and that's the first financing I've closed where I haven't actually sat in a room with any of the investors who put money into that round. And that, I think, makes a huge difference but we're not having to fly down to New York for the roadshow anymore. We can actually, we're normalized, whether we're on the West Coast, the East Coast, London, Germany, Israel, actually, we're all on the end of a Zoom call. And I think that actually has helped, particularly for companies who are now outside the US who want to make noise and be in front of the US investors, to be in front of the pharma companies. we're all just on the end of a Zoom call now, and that somehow seems to have normalized it a bit more. And I think it's great for particularly non-US biotech and companies that are building and trying to obviously navigate the ecosystem there as well.
Yeah. Well,
I'm just going to make a more general point on international M&A, because historically the UK government has had quite a laissez-faire view on M&A. They've let foreign companies come in and buy up a lot of UK assets. You look at Sanofi and Kymab earlier this year, you look at GW Pharma and Jazz. I think the tide may be turning in the sense that they're introducing some new legislation next year called the National Security and Investment Act, which basically, if you look at what's happening with ARM, they're investigating that deal on national security concerns, but they're going to start looking much more heavily at other sectors as well. And there's 17 sensitive sectors they've highlighted, one of which is synthetic biology. So I think they might start looking at some of these foreign takeovers a little bit more closely, and you may see a little bit more protectionism coming into the market.
yeah, that's interesting, because we've seen that big pharma in the past year or so, some companies have got large amounts of cash for various reasons, like Novartis selling its Roche stake, J&J looking to offload its consumer business. So already there was a lot of dry powder in big pharma. Now there's even more. What's going to happen, do you think, with big pharma? How is the way it behaves towards spending money on the biotech sector going to evolve? And maybe that's going to be a factor in the UK, but what do we think globally?
I think with the protectionism, I think we need to be careful that we're not discouraging people from actually, and particularly investors who start these companies from potentially being able to exit and make returns, which ultimately is, spurring innovation in the sector. I mean, that's my fear there. I think COVID has kind of heightened this fear. I think people now recognise the strategic and kind of medical importance of the sector. And we're getting people move from outside of the traditional pharma sphere into life sciences. We're getting the tech companies, and I heard of a company that actually worked in retail the other day talking about moving into life sciences. So we're getting these kind of people that aren't familiar with the sector moving in, and then government protection on top of that. I don't know. I think we need to tread very carefully about how this impacts on the ground innovation. I'm not intimately familiar with that bill, but I know this is a concern to a lot of people.
Supporting it or condoning it. I'm just saying that it's on its way.
I think, but in terms of kind of pharma deal making, I mean, I'm quite bullish about 2022 in general. I think there's pent up demand there, as I said earlier.
Because it's been pretty muted this year, with the exception of Merck, Acceleron, that type of deal.
Yeah.
There's not been a lot.
If you take that out, I think it was pretty flat, to be honest. So I think it'll be a good year to be a biotech, is my prediction. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess there hasn't been an awful lot. We've been waiting for big pharma to do more deals for quite a few years, and there was the tax inversion kind of flurry, and then that was dampened down. And maybe
I think if you look at M&A this year, it's really down, right?
Yeah.
I guess the question is sort of, is it going to continue to? There is dry powder there. Is it going to come in the form of M&A, or is it going to be returned to shareholders in other means, right? Yeah. And what type of M&A? Is it the bolt-ons, or is it actually some of the bigger transformative M&A deals that we saw, historically going back years now? I think it'll be interesting to watch to see how that theme plays out. I mean, certainly Merck's done a few acquisitions over the last year, and obviously the most recent one, but also Pandion and others. So there's been quite a lot of, bolt-on activity over the last 2 or 3 years. If you look back, maybe not so much last year. So I think it's, I'm excited as well for 22 to see how that plays through into the biotech space.
Yeah.
And there's been a bit of housekeeping, hasn't there, from some of the big pharma. If you look at Glaxo and Johnson & Johnson, which are actually divesting some of their divisions to focus back on life science and biotech. So once they've got through this period of house cleaning, they might be able to sort of refocus on external deals.
With the kind of flourishing of these new complicated technologies, you'd think that it would make sense for big pharma to be investing more and more in those areas and building bulk. The more drugs that get launched, and as Mike was mentioning, half of drugs are expected, because it Gottlieb, but also Roche has said they're expecting half of the drugs being launched in the next few years to be cell and gene therapies or gene therapies. Yeah. I realise it's now nearly 20 past, and I wanted to give people a chance to ask some questions. There's a man here in the middle with a mask on.
Yeah, Yeah, slightly tangential question. That given what Mike was saying earlier about China being the second largest market, etc., in terms of investment, partnering, access to money, and all the rest of it, is China now becoming irrelevant? I'm thinking of how they're starting to close up, and they've obviously had a number of big tech failures. I mean, big failures. Is that going to impact the investment and deal making globally?
Any thoughts?
And it is tangential, I do.
I mean, certainly from a broader point of view, there is what we're terming a decoupling at the moment, where China is basically cutting itself off from the rest of the world, and you've seen that with some delistings from US markets, and they're becoming much more introverted. I mean, I think looking more broadly, I think this relates to President Xi. He's introduced this new mantra of common prosperity, which basically means he doesn't want to have these huge successful entrepreneurs who've worth billions, the Jack Ma's, and he's looking to basically cement his position as he goes into beyond what is allowed as a president, isn't it? Normally you're allowed to have 10 years. He now wants to do 20 years, probably more. So he's going for a period of basically cementing his core base, introducing this common prosperity. But my gut feeling is things might quieten down next year, and he may not be attacking entrepreneurs, particularly in the tech and medical sectors, so much once he's shored up his political position.
Other questions? Back there, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so just a quick question. How important are decentralized trials in the new way of working in making pipelines move quicker and commercial attractability for deals?
It's a question about decentralized trials.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's undoubtedly an interesting area in the way things are going. I think, yeah, I mean, anything you can kind of do to innovate in that space is clearly really important to get that kind of flow through for assets. And I think any kind of innovation we can do in that space is undoubtedly going to ease bottlenecks, both for pharma and for biotech as well. And I think, yeah, that is, as you pointed out, is a really important and really interesting area.
I certainly know from our experience writing about the sector that has been a huge story, gets lots of hits on our when we write about that topic. I'm not sure how much that affects deal making, or are companies having to sign deals with CROs or additional companies that have expertise, you know, in digital technology and AI and so on to support that.
I think one of the benefits of working for Pharma is my clinical development colleagues can...
We maybe don't have the right panel to answer that.
So yeah, I wouldn't want to comment. It wouldn't be.
Yeah. Okay. Mike, you have a question?
Yeah, great panel, guys. Well done. A couple of things I'd like to sort of pick up, and actually it's, I think I'm going to be picking on David and Luke. Luke, first a sort of a comment, it's sort of like a quasi-rhetorical question. When you're sort of saying that, you know, you were able to raise all this money, you didn't have to actually meet anybody, that's clearly true if you had already built up those relationships. Mm-hmm. For young companies that are on the start, that's obviously going to be something different. So what Dave was sort of saying about, you know, sort of having an event like this is much better than having those virtual partnering meetings, even though, you know, people have done a fairly good job. So that's sort of to sort of say it's a sort of almost a rhetorical.
No, it's a fair point. I think, you know, I put that in the context of a Series B crossover round as opposed to raising money in a seed or a Series A round, where I think the dynamic probably is quite different still. It's, unless that's been sort of incubator informed and that sort of company creation model that we talked about earlier, you know, that is a lot about, you know, getting out there, networking, and finding the right investors who can believe. And it's a different journey than, say, a company that's been going 2 years and has a very clear story to go and raise sort of Series B, Series C, whatever it may look like. So yeah, I think that's not an unfair comment.
And the second thing, and you both David and you sort of alluded to it, and it was that, you know, the deals, the sort of the terms, it doesn't have to be about the cash. It's about other assets. So I was just interested to sort of, what do you think are going to be the most important currencies that you're going to be seeking from Big Pharma? I mean, we've seen, for example, co-commercialization deals, which, 10 years ago, when people were doing it, the pharma companies say, yeah, sure, knowing fine well that the biotech company was never going to have the wherewithal or the ability to be able to do it. Whereas now we're actually sort of seeing them being created that look more robust. So I just sort of was wondering, what do you think sort of the kind of deals we're going to see that we haven't seen in the past will look like, and what will be the currency for those deals?
I think if we take the basis that there is this, apparently endless sea of cash out there at the moment. I'm going to check the locker room later, but there is more cash available to SMEs and this appetite for investment. That takes perhaps one of the key terms, it's still a key term, from your term sheet. And so it is about accessing the resources, what the resources might be, and as I mentioned before, translating it. And that will be obviously the clinical excellence, etc., that the Mercs of this world bring to it. It's also how the IP is dealt with. We've all been on the end of a bit of a bullying from Big Pharma and almost disrespect as to how you can be treated and so forth. I think you can focus more around that when the cash in bank is less pressing on you as opposed to I've got 6 weeks to payroll. I think it helps so you can pivot on the terms and really get terms that are going to affect the science moving on, the platform moving on, and getting to a drug substance. So I think it's a really good point you made.
Yeah, maybe just building on, I think the sort of responsibilities of what partner does what in the relationship, I think as you have outlined, sort of has evolved. I think it's now much more of a discussion about what makes sense for the two parties together to accelerate and de-risk, as opposed to, you push it here, give it to us, and we'll push it on from there. And whether that plays through on the manufacturing side, if you're on advanced modalities, or whether that plays through in terms of development and commercial, I think you're seeing a lot more creativity in the way those deals are put together, with optionality, quite frankly, for the biotechs. We may not know now if in 5 years' time we want to be doing X and Y, but there's flexibility built into those types of structures to enable us to have that conversation down the road once we have a better view of how the portfolio is shaped out and where we want to put our own investment in terms of those types of capabilities. So I think that probably is a product of a more leveling of the playing field maybe between biotech and pharma, but those types of discussions are real and happening. I think you've seen lots of deals with more creative structures like that, and I think you'll probably continue to see those, particularly in these types of modalities.
Thank you.
So I was interested in one of the comments earlier around pharma increasingly looking to biotech to provide manufacturing capabilities, particularly for some of the new modalities. And I was just wondering if I could press a little more on that. And is the vision really for biotech companies to grow and build and staff their own manufacturing facilities, or is it more of a vision for a virtual manufacturing outsourcing using GMP CROs for the manufacturing?
I'll take it first. I think it probably depends on your modality. I think certainly the philosophy we have at Quell is that as a young cell therapy developer, we think actually having manufacturing capabilities and infrastructure under our control is really important as we translate the science into the early development of that manufacturing process. And so as we built out Quell, we've gone down a model, we've built an internal team to do all of this, the CMC, PD through manufacturing, QC, etc. And we're actually putting our own team into GMP manufacturing suites here in the UK to manufacture products for our clinical development trials. And I think that's in large part to de-risk the application of the science through to the manufacturing footprint for a cell therapy modality. And I'm not saying that would play through in every particular field. And I think when you think about gene therapy or more conventional modalities, obviously there's probably not that much. But with cells, when the product is the cell you're making, I think it's kind of different. And actually, I would say in the context of the deal-making discussions, that's where I think the larger pharma who don't necessarily have those capabilities are actually saying it's fantastic that you guys can do that in-house, and you've got the capability in-house to do it, because we can then tap into that as a way to get into the clinic faster with diseases that we're interested in exploring. Of course, there is a CDMO market, and I think that is an equation, but I think there's sort of a development and a maturation of that's kind of going on in parallel.
And I think I completely agree with everything you said, but I think speaking from the kind of pharma's perspective, that translating from the kind of proof of concept and the manufacturing piece is a key de-risking step in a lot of those cell therapy type approaches. And obviously, I think that's part of the reason why, when we look to partner with innovative biotechs, we're looking for this innovation, and for me, that's a key innovation piece that they bring to the table. Obviously, I think there's, the cell and gene therapy market, holds great promise, but there are still questions to be ironed out, right, and innovation to be done. And I think when a biotech comes and they've got answers to those questions and they're working on them in-house and they are actually manufacturing these things, it's fantastic, yeah. So I think, if we could do it ourselves, then, we probably would just do it ourselves. So that's why we partner with biotech. And indeed, as I said before, 65% of our revenue from human medicines comes from assets that we've either licensed or acquired externally. So it's key for us.
Okay, thank you. We're pretty much running out of time. We just take one more question.
I think this works. With this influx of cash, what does it necessarily mean for collaborations with, say, universities from a deep science point of view, or even quick collaborations? Would this larger capacity for biotech to move things forward more mean that there would be a further look into that instead?
I think it works both ways, actually. If I think about Quell as an example, we've got a number of academic collaborations that we're using actually as a way of pushing forward the platform. So in our neuroinflammation program, we work with the team up at the University of Sheffield, Pam Shaw and her team at the Citron Institute really closely, as a way to kind of leverage pushing those programs forward with academic partners, and obviously at some point it becomes more of a commercial program, and obviously collaborating with other academics to explore areas of the biology and technology that we can't necessarily do everything in-house in the context of driving forward to value creation. So I think it's still really critical part of building biotechs. It's sort of the other end of the spectrum, but we have discussions that go that way, and then also a lot of academic discussions that go that way, and there's a lot of innovation there that we can still tap into as young biotechs, and I think it'd be foolish not to keep looking at that.
I would concur with that. I've done a number of academic deals in different companies over the years. It's a great intellectual resource, and I don't see why that should change whatsoever. I would still caution that, from the academic side, that we find a better way of commercialising and translating that science, and it can often be quite a frustration. And clearly we have different KPIs. We come at the world from different angles, and that's the beauty of it all. But at the same time, sometimes I always, on deals, find the expectation from a university, TTO, or whatever the office might be, can be unrealistic and could be quite challenging for a company. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be the company who will take the risk and really do the long-term investment into it, whether it's as a biotech or get passed on through pharma. And you have to unencumber that as much as you can, still have a fair share of any success. But I think you have to get the science out there, and I've seen a lot of deals stifled, and I've walked away from a number over the years because the expectation is just not realistic. We're going to be putting in 3-5 years plus of serious investment, and we can't have the billions up front. You can get the billions of share when it's successful, but not at the beginning. And some of the other areas, IP and so forth as well, can be bit of a sticking point.
An area to work on maybe over the next year.
Another topic, yeah.
So,
but we can do better. That's the frustration. We could do so much better. Maybe we just don't get the experience back into academia. Perhaps it's a one-way channel generally.
Yeah, it would be a whole other panel, I think. Just want to wrap up now by asking each of the panelists in turn to answer the question, how will biopharma deals evolve in 2022, in one sentence. We have -3 minutes left. Will.
I'm going to be patriotic after slamming the FTSE earlier, and I think they're going to attract more life science and biotech companies to list in the UK rather than NASDAQ.
Good. Luke?
Okay, and I guess in a young entrepreneurial business, I have to remain optimistic about the deal flow into next year. So I'm really excited and looking forward to an increase in M&A and an increase in big transformational strategic partnerships, and certainly for Quell, it's an exciting outlook for us.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I think a big uptick in deals in 2022 is my prediction. I think these will be driven by kind of early stage deals with pharma trying to access novel innovative platforms.
Thank you. And David, finally.
And I think, if there is this release of cash from some of the big pharma and unleashing that, and then central bank policies stay as they are, then there will be cash around in the world, and I think we will see more investment. I think, to Mike's point, I think there will be still money into the AI bubble but at some time it will pop because the big tech companies will come in or the big pharma companies will go in and succeed. And if I've just got one question for the audience, if that's all right.
Please do.
So who's going to go to JPM Morgan next month? Okay. In person. Oh, in person, yeah.
In person?
Right.
One
Well,
couple.
the flight's still booked. I'm not sure if I'm going.
Right.
We'll see. I mean, I don't think there's still a lot of fence sitting on that one.
I get a lot of people, peers who are asking me the question. That's why I just do a
Yeah.
straw
We've
poll
just
really to see
decided
what it
not-
was like.
We're not
Yeah.
going in person this year.
And if you want to like check booking.com websites out, you can still get hotel rooms in San Fran, which would never be possible normally. And they're actually only got 4 zeros on the end of them per night, as opposed to the usual. So I suspect there's a lot of people holding back.
Have you got your Airbnb booked already? Or you know?
No, I'm not going.
You're not going? No,
Well, there we are.
I'm not going.
It's going to be very quiet.
We'll do it in London.
Can I just make a comment of it? I don't think JPM is relevant, but the satellites which you can go virtually are. Everybody's going virtually.
Yeah. Yeah, we are going virtually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to our panel today.
Okay, so it must be time for